Welcome to this CNBC Africa special conversation on the fourth industrial revolution. And our guest today is the World Economic Forum President, Mr. Borge Brende, and of course the Minister for ICT for Rwanda, Mrs. Paula Ingabire. Now I want to give you a little bit of context before we get into this. Africa as a continent missed the first, second, third industrial revolutions, and we're trying to get into the fourth industrial revolutions. But there are a couple of things that we need to do as a continent to get into the fourth industrial revolution, to enjoy the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. What are those things? Now we're going to tackle those, and if you want to be part of this conversation, tweet us at CNBC Africa. You could tag me at The Real Quizzer. Thank you guys, and thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having us.
So I was taught properly, my mom, and she said ladies first, so I'll go with Minister Paula first. Minister Paula, thank you for hosting us here today. And the Center for Industrial Revolution is the reason as to why we are here. Rwanda has always taken 3-4 steps ahead, especially in ICT, and try to be very digital and inclusive as it does that. Why is this such a landmark moment, not only for Rwanda, but for the continent as a whole, and at a time when we are trying to operationalize the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement?
Thank you very much. And maybe let me start off with the importance of the center. The center is part of a larger network of close to more than 15 centers across the world that are established with partnership with the World Economic Forum. And the idea of the center, Rwanda being the first to be officially launched, the second one that already exists is in South Africa. And again, the idea of having these centers is really designed around the fact that the rate at which technological innovation is happening is very fast-paced, that many times all countries developed and developing, the regulations and policies are always playing catch-up. And so one would ask yourself, and I remember when the very first center in San Francisco was set up, and the idea was to say, how do you advise policymakers on how they can create the right policies and right regulations that can nurture these innovations? Because the absence of these policies and regulations when you have the innovations already coming to the market has its risks in itself. And so to your point of, one, Africa is poised to really benefit, lead and leapfrog within the fourth industrial revolution. But to do that, there's so many other building blocks that have to be in place. You mentioned the CFTA, which is really one particular example where we feel with the work of the center. And earlier today, as we launched the center, we talked about some of the very early work that the center has been involved in, which is really helping the ministry, the government of Rwanda, in putting in place the data protection and privacy law. And why is that important? What does that mean for a layman person? Data today is the new gold, is the new oil, depending how you see it. It's a strategic asset. As we embark on our agenda of becoming digital economies across the world, even in Africa very particularly, we're going to be leveraging data in driving policies, in creating new business models, in driving better service delivery, in driving scientific and medical research. But how do you do that in a world where also the same asset that we're talking about, there's a lot of issues around mistrust and security that that have to be unlocked. And so without those kind of regulations like the data protection and privacy regulation, then we won't be able to benefit, because you're not able to even collect this data and process it to really unlock the different benefits that we have. So in a nutshell, the creation of the center today and tying it to your question of CFTA is, one, going to unlock the different governance frameworks, some of them that will hinge on data, unlocking data sharing frameworks across the continent as we trade across borders.
Interesting that you bring up regulation there in your conversation. And again, we're leapfrogging because I think we could have had this a little bit later in the conversation. Borge, bring regulation. When people listen to regulation, they feel like it's something that ties them down. It's something that stops them from doing something else. So that's more or less a glass half empty. Let's look at it as a glass half full. Why is regulation and something like the Center for Industrial Revolution being set up in Rwanda important for not only Africa, but regulation globally in the new technological world we're moving to?
So maybe let me illustrate it with traffic rules. How would it be to drive on the road if there were no traffic rules at all? It would even be more dangerous and very unpredictable. The power of the new technologies, being artificial intelligence or big data, as also Minister was alluding to, can play a constructive role in and work in the interest of humankind. But we also want traffic rules when it comes to these new technologies, because they can also be used in a way that is not beneficial to humankind. So what we're trying with the 15 centers, and also now with the great center here in Rwanda, is to look at how can, for example, data be the new oxygen in the economy. And at the same time, we also have to think about privacy. We have to think about the rules on how we utilize big data.
I feel like we've run before we walk. So Minister Paula, I want us to walk for a minute. And before we get to the regulation, key skills that are needed, education is one of those. We've seen AIMS come into play. We've seen CMU also being set up here as well. Why is it important to invest in education, and what is the plan to enable not only Rwandans but citizens of the continent be skilled enough for the fourth industrial revolution?
I'm glad you brought that up, because we've been asked this question a couple of times. Regulations, then what? And I think in our case, it's not a question of one thing or the other. It's rather how do we make these parallel investments in the different, what I call building blocks. So we did talk about the part of regulations, which is very important, because as we talk about talent, I think education has been disrupted largely. We are no longer building talent through the traditional education system. We also build talent while on the job, while experimenting with building, systems and solutions. And in doing so, you're also increasing, the quality and level of the talent base that you're really putting in place. Now, back to some of the examples that you shared, we have the Africa Institute for Mathematical Sciences that is specializing in research programs around artificial intelligence and machine learning. You have the Carnegie Mellon University, the Africa Campus that is set up here, and one of the programs that they are also providing is around data science, AI. But you also have our Center for AI that is based within our University of Rwanda. So all these are different pieces of education institutions that are helping us to build the much required talent. But that's not enough. I think at the end of the day, while these may be research programs, PhD, master's, or bachelor's level degree, we also need to be able to see short-term type of programs in data science and even other fields that can help in the shortest time possible to bridge the gap of talent that we really have today. And that investment continues to happen. The universities I just mentioned today are set up as Pan-African universities, and that is very important for us because, one, we're establishing ourselves as an innovation hub, but it also means we want to be able to attract talent from across the continent to come and benefit from this world-class education that we've set up here. But at the same time, as we solve continental problems, global challenges, you need perspectives that are global. You need perspectives that are beyond just Rwanda. So think about having some students that have come from the western part of Africa or northern, and they sit together and they're trying to solve a problem, even if it's a problem around how do we improve healthcare service delivery using AI. Because they understand the context of what it is in a country like Benin, and someone that is coming from Egypt also has that context, and get paired up with someone in Rwanda. When they build solutions that can be applicable to the different markets. And that's why it's important for us, because we're not just creating solutions here, we're creating solutions that can scale elsewhere. So to answer you very briefly, it's not an area that is forgotten, rather it's these parallel investments. Today we are launching the center that is heavily focused on policy and regulation, but the investments in education have started more than 8 years ago, and we're going to even find more investments that can be put in place so that we bridge the talent gap.
She takes us to the next question, perfect segue, which is work in the fourth industrial revolution. We're coming from a black swan moment in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen loss of jobs or people being laid off, and there's a fear, rightfully so. When it comes to the fourth industrial revolution, something like that being brought into play, people are afraid that, okay, these jobs are being taken away. What jobs are going to be created in the future? So what jobs are going to be created?
We have to avoid that when the economy is now growing again after COVID. It should definitely not be a jobless growth. So some jobs are now definitely coming back, in the service sector, tourism sector, when people start to travel and moving around again. And in some countries, there is in fact then a lack of people to some jobs. But in young population countries like Rwanda, I think it's like 50% of the population is under 30 years old, there has to be created a lot of jobs moving forward. And let's make sure that the fourth industrial revolution is something positive in this context. As you said at the beginning, Africa did lose out on the first, second, and third industrial revolution. How can we secure that the fourth industrial revolution that are built on these technologies, and where access to, for example, quality broadband is a prerequisite for being part of this industrial revolution, but it also gives huge opportunities. For example, for young people in Rwanda, they can work now remotely with other big companies all over the world. They can set up their own company here that can compete also on the internet. So done the right way, with the right skills and with the right investments, it can open up for huge leapfrogging also for developing countries. So that's why we're so focused also on the centers now. For example, in Africa, we have the first one now inaugurated here in Rwanda. We also have one in South Africa, and we hope that can be part of also building great future for the young people of Africa and Rwanda.
I want to come back to you with a private sector role, so government. The government's role in ensuring that we get to the fourth industrial revolution, in ensuring that citizens are ready for it. With practical examples, what is the government of Rwanda doing to ensure that young people, or even reskilling those that are already in the workforce, are ready for the fourth industrial revolution, so that people are not left behind?
Yeah. So more practically, let's even start off with what Borge mentioned just a short while ago. Much as we know that with these emerging technologies, there's a potential for job losses, I think the quick question is, how do you get there? Because you can't avoid it at some point, right? So rather than avoid thinking about it or doing something about it, the key thing is to say what jobs have the potential the next 5 to 10 years to be relevant within the economy, and what other new jobs are going to be created that will almost overtake the ones that will be lost in 5 to 10 years, and what can we do to skill this workforce to get there? I did mention a while ago, some of the academic programs that we have in place, but those can only address maybe 10, 20% of what you're looking for. So I like what you said, reskilling, upskilling, that is needed. And how do you do that? Even working very closely with institutions that have the capacity building mandate in really mapping out which sectors are going to be disrupted the most, which industries are going to be disrupted the most when it comes to the increasing adoption of digital technologies. I remember a few years ago when government, today the government of Rwanda, most of our services are provided online through a centralized platform, which is Irembo. But before then, we were trying to put in place different solutions, tech solutions that can help improve efficiencies within organizations. And I remember one particular system, which was the document tracking and workflow management system. The idea of that system really was to say, when you get courier within an organization, who follows up on it and tracks it until it's responded on? Because sometimes you get a call, I sent a letter, I didn't get it, and no one knows where it is within the organization. Interestingly, as we started to deploy that solution, what happened that we hadn't anticipated, and again, when we deploy most of these solutions, there are some of the unintended consequences, was that for some of those front desk officers whose job was to receive, it became like a threat to their jobs. Because now you're bringing a system that technically would be helping with the tracking of most of this information. So we had to take a step back, and actually at some point had to put a pause on the rollout to skill these same people, because we're saying what we're avoiding you doing is walking office to office, door to door to check how far a letter is or making phone calls. So let's train you to be able to use this system that we're giving you to improve on the work that you're doing. And it was really at the very onset of deploying many of these solutions across government institutions, but it was also an eye-opening experience for us to know that as technology experts, it's not just a question of deploying a system, it's actually thinking about the human-system interface that is going to happen. And from the onset, before you design the system, you start to train and skill people so that they are comfortable to adopt and not resist some of these emerging technologies. And we continue to see this in different parts. Now, I just wanted to give you that example because you asked for a practical one, but I think
it's quite practical.
In terms of what government should do, I think governments should take a lead in even adopting these fourth industrial revolution technologies. We can't say our role is to put in place policies and regulations, yet at the same time, we're not open to deploying some of these technologies. And that's why part of the work that you'll start to see the center doing with some of the key sectors around healthcare, around trade, around education, is to figure out those use cases, those examples where we think we can apply the use of AI. Because we have large data sets, how do we then build AI models that will help with the decision-making process so that at least we take the lead in adopting these. Training and building literacy for our citizens is our core mandate. So even as we take on those use cases, at the end of the day, we're taking them to deliver a service to a citizen. We need to be able to empower a citizen, not only with the ability to understand and appreciate the investments made, but we talked about earlier the data protection law. People need to understand, why am I giving up my personal data? I should have agency over it, but if I don't want to be used, I should also be allowed not to be used it. But that is going to require a lot of sensitization, a lot of training, and then lastly, obviously, it's making the necessary investments. So whether it's in education, whether it's building the infrastructure, and I think this is where really the role that government plays, but also, and I know you're going to go to Borge with a question on the private sector, which is something the private sector always asks us about. Government, you don't open up your data to us. Because if I'm building a service, I need good data that will help me to make a relevant solution that comes to address a certain problem. And so coupled with the policy and regulatory aspects that are in place, it's also really the whole mindset that needs to change, but also putting in place an open data platform where government can avail data sets that can be used by researchers, by the private sector, so that we can inspire a thriving data economy.
Between a rock and a hard place, Minister Paula there, but so she said as to your role, the private sector, or when you speak to members of the private sector, what can be their role in getting us there?
So I think the power of public-private cooperation is a strong one. So what we have identified at the World Economic Forum as one of the major challenges is that to be able to leapfrog, everyone has to have the same starting point when it comes to access, for example, to well-functioning broadband. And the reality is that on our planet, there is maybe 3.8 billion people that has great access to broadband, but there is still more than 3 billion that don't have that. So what we did at the World Economic Forum was to bring together governments and leading CEOs from the big companies of the world and say, how can we make sure that the telecommunication businesses and others can contribute to also connecting the more than 3 billion people that don't have access. So if you're going to see digitalization of the economy, of course, people then have to have the chance to get their account, do fintech, wiring money through the internet, and also have access to it. And if you're going to do also remote schooling, you have to, in these schools, have quality internet. So this is one place where, in one area, when we have challenged also global businesses, it's not only the government's role. Of course, the government has a key role as a regulator, but also investing money in it. But in many countries, the money is simply not there. And then the private sector can also do their part.
Inclusiveness is key to everything. We are seeing inequality, inequity across the world. That gap is just widening, yet we seem to be taking steps. So it's a 4 steps, 5 steps back situation. Minister Paula, can the 4th industrial revolution solve the lack of inclusiveness for many communities across the world? And how can it do it?
The answer is yes. Just like any other technology, I think inclusiveness has to be a design requirement, has to be at the heart of how you design the system, you design the technology to be able to cater for those inclusive aspects that you talk about. I just talked about AI, and I mean, biases have been in all shapes and form when it comes to artificial intelligence. But then again, the question becomes, who is building the technology? And that takes me back to some of the questions you really asked, which are very relevant in a time like now where Africa is looking to lead in the fourth industrial revolution, which is really around talent. When you have engineers or developers or a team, and it's not diverse enough in building the technology or building a solution that depends on that technology, then you're bound to have the gaps around not being as inclusive as one should be, or the biases that we talk about. So I think we're at a great place where knowing that and being aware of those biases and also being aware of those shortcomings, you then navigate that around the teams that are building this. How much are they thinking about this? So inclusiveness is one, privacy by design is another. Because many of these fourth industrial revolutions, one of the challenges is around privacy. And so inclusiveness, privacy, transparency are some of the key core design principles when it comes to how we build these technologies, but also how we build solutions around these technologies.
Coming back to you as government, again, putting you in that hard place. Israel spends close to 8% of their GDP on research and development. South Korea, 5-6%. Africa as a continent, less than 1% on R&D. How do we up that? How do we, because for us to lead, it's, 1 + 1 is 2, not 11.
Exactly.
So how do we ensure that more goes to R&D?
Yeah, and that's really an area that we really need to focus on a lot as a continent. And to your point, you're right. When you look at the Global Innovation Index and you look at the different rankings of different countries and how they're faring in the innovation space, the ones that rank highest, when you look at how much portion of GDP is assigned to research and development, it tells you a different story from those that are really at the bottom. And if we are not investing and being deliberate about growing our size or share of R&D, what ends up happening is that we're doing copycat of innovations. We'll just pull innovations from elsewhere and try and replicate them a little bit to maybe our context, but they won't be real innovation happening. But I also believe right now, as many governments are putting technology and innovation at the center stage of their socio-economic development agenda, there's that increasing pressure that we all know and are aware of to see what does it take today to really increase the portion of GDP on research and development. Of course, you can appreciate that what has happened over time, a lot of efforts and emphasis in terms of investments have been in putting in place the infrastructure. Borge talked about the over 3.3 billion population globally that is still unconnected. Majority of that, more than 50% of those, are in Africa. And so that's why you see a lot of focus, even for governments and policymakers, is to say, how do we even provide that basic infrastructure for any citizen in place? And they can start to use some of the basic services, but then at the same time, we're now increasingly saying the need to say, while we invest in infrastructure, even as we build talent, like we said, research and development is central. And I think you asked this as government, and I want to come back to when we talk about public-private sector cooperation. Research and development can't be driven only by public investments. This is where we also want the private sector, whether it's a manufacturing company or a medical company, whatever it is, how much of their revenues are invested back into research and development, which translates into new products or better products or services that go to their clients. So that aggregation of what both the private sector and the government are doing is what will ultimately contribute to a higher percentage of GDP going to research and development. So that's really an area, and I'll say it for Rwanda, where we know very much today we stand at 0.6% of our GDP in research and development. We've had conversations of saying, what is it going to take to even bring it as close to 3%? You can imagine how much that is going to mean. But that also is going to be driven by what are the industries that we've already mapped out, where this money of research and development will go in as we build an army of researchers that can benefit from this. So it's definitely a challenge that we're very much aware of, but also a challenge that every policymaker in their different role is already thinking about what is going to be my contribution to really growing the envelope on research and development, but not just ticking the box that it's 3%, but rather saying how has it translated into new products, new services, and also competitiveness for us as an economy.
Okay, what's the cost of missing out on the fourth industrial revolution?
I think that would lead to a situation where you will have less growth and prosperity than the countries that are on top of this new technologies. You also have to apply them then in your more traditional industries, and as I mentioned also in agriculture, fisheries, and etc. One of the reasons why you see so much competition between China and the US today, the G2, that is almost 50% of the global economy, is that they're competing on who is going to lead on these new technologies, because both of them do know that the leading nation in this field will come out of this century as the most powerful and prosperous one. What we're trying to do here is to make sure that it is also a possibility to leapfrog from those countries that did not do so well in the first, second, and third industrial revolution. And I strongly believe that it is still possible to have emerging economies and developing economies be part of this fourth industrial revolution and do well. And there is no reason why they can't have some of the leading companies in the world in the future. Could even be here in Rwanda or in Nairobi. Because if you look at the 10 largest companies in the world now by market cap, 7 of them are in the technology sector, and 7 of them did not exist 20 years ago. So many of the leading companies in the future have not started yet. So there's no reason why the next big one should be then in a garage in Silicon Valley. It could also be in a garage here in Kigali.
Well, all good things come to an end, unfortunately. This is a conversation that could have gone on until the sun comes down. Thank you for making the time, Borge. Thank you, Minister Paula, as well. Now, if you want to be part of the conversation we had here today, tweet us at CNBC Africa. You could tell me at The Real Quizzer. Have a great rest of your day.